It was autumn. Evening had long since fallen as I was walking home from work. The wind rustled through the fallen leaves, whispering something almost unintelligible. The street lamps flickered, casting dim light onto the empty road. I quickened my pace, eager to get home into the warmth. Suddenly, a man appeared beside me. There was nothing particularly unusual about him, just an ordinary passerby. He was wearing an old jacket and a hat that had loose threads hanging from it, and he kept his gaze on the road. It seemed like he was also just heading home. He turned to me and said, "Dark out here, isn't it? Want me to walk you home?" Without thinking much, I nodded. Having someone walk with me didn't seem like a bad idea. Plus, the streets were deserted, and the company felt welcome. We walked in silence, but something about him began to unsettle me. He smelled odd, a faint, musty scent, like an old, abandoned house. But I brushed it off. It's autumn, it's damp. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. He spoke again, his voice low, almost distant.
Have you ever had those days where it feels like the whole world has forgotten about you?
I shrugged.
Yeah, I guess, sometimes.
I had one of those days, he continued, not looking at me. One day I was walking home too. It was cold, and the rain was drizzling, much like tonight. I had just quit my job, couldn't take it anymore. My wife had left, my friends had turned their backs. And you know what? That night I went down to the river, wanted to be alone. Thought it would be easier to think there. I felt a chill creeping up my spine. His words seemed to resonate with something dark inside me, touching on some deep-seated fear. I wanted to change the subject, but he went on. I stood right at the edge of the water, and suddenly I felt like ending it all, just stepping in and letting it all go. But something held me back. He paused, and I noticed how unnaturally his fingers trembled. "We're almost home, aren't we?" he asked suddenly. I looked up and saw my house. We were just a few steps from my building. I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. I wanted to get inside quickly, but something kept pulling me back. "Thanks for walking me," I said, trying to hide my discomfort. "No problem," he muttered. "We both know that sometimes you don't come home the way you expect to." His words made me tense up, and suddenly it clicked. Where had I seen him before? Why did his face seem so familiar? I slowly turned to him. His figure began to blur, his face growing paler, like a foggy silhouette. A wave of terror washed over me as I remembered. I had read about him in a newspaper a few weeks ago, a man who had drowned in the river not far from here. They found him only days later. It was him. I stood frozen in place, watching as his form faded away. He stared right into my eyes until the very last moment, before disappearing entirely, leaving only the cold wind and the rustling of fallen leaves behind. My heart pounded in my chest so hard I thought it might burst. I ran into my building, slammed the door shut, and stood there for a few moments, listening to the silence. But there was no one. Just me, the wind, and the memory of someone who no longer belonged to the living.